Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Readings from Oconomowaukee virtual event series. I'm Daniel Goldin from Boswell Book Company. I give you Lisa Baudoin from Books and Company.
So welcome everybody and welcome Suzette. Suzette Mayr is the author of 6 novels, including The Widows, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Monaceros, which was longlisted for the 2011 Giller Prize. And her most recent book, The Sleeping Car Porter, won the 2022 Giller Prize Award. So congratulations. That was quite a thrill for us as we were scheduling this event. Suzette Mayr teaches creative writing at the University of Calgary. She has worked with the Calgary Theatre Company, Theatre Junction, visual artists Lisa Braun and Jeff Hunter, and was a writer in residence at the University of Calgary and at Baudoin University in Pennsylvania. She and her partner live in Calgary, and she joins us today from Calgary. So welcome. We are thrilled to have you.
Hello, I'm thrilled to be here. This is so awesome.
Do you want to give us a little elevator pitch about the Sleeping Car Porter and maybe read a few pages for us?
For sure. So the Sleeping Car Porter is set in 1929, and it takes place on a transcontinental train that travels from Toronto, so easternish Canada, all the way to Vancouver, which is on the west coast, so just above Seattle, I think. So, and the thing about that particular train was that it was the fastest train in the continent for 1929. So it was 88 hours and 45 minutes. And in my book, we follow, the main character is a sleeping car porter named Baxter, who is a Black man, as sleeping car porters typically were in the United States and also in Canada. And the thing about Baxter is that he's also a closeted gay man. And so as he's traveling across the country, he comes across a French postcard, which is basically an erotic postcard, but has 2 naked men entwined with each other. And it sort of sparks him awake, especially the parts of himself that he's been trying to repress. And the train gets caught in the Rocky Mountains, and it's stuck in the Rocky Mountains for 45 hours, and hijinks ensue. I hope that makes sense. So the train becomes kind of a hot house where suddenly it becomes a psychodrama where everybody explodes in every way conceivable. And I'm going to read just from the very beginning of the book, just to give you a sense of what it's about. I'll just read a little bit. So this is the very opening page. Toronto to Winnipeg, Monday, 10:45 p.m. Eastern to Wednesday, 9:15 p.m. Central. 9:45 p.m. Standing next to his step box, Baxter hovers, immobile and elastic, ready to spring forward, to lift a suitcase, dissect a timetable, point to the conductor, nod, lift more suitcases, now hat boxes, answer more questions, and nod, nod, nod. Trouser cuffs drag in the dust. Shiny boot heels clap against the train station platform. A child runs towards an observation car. Ribbons and tickets and goodbye letters swish to the ground. Hands reach towards Baxter, grab at him for a lift up, grab his coat pocket, wave in his face. A sea swell of passengers spilling towards his car, a maelstrom of departure time panic. R.T. Baxter, dentist to be, man who longs to lance gums and extract pathological third molars, standing here next to this train, caught in this hurricane, drowsy already. Boarding Baxter's train car, pushing past a mother squeezing the elbows of her tot, a man shaped like a heart, shaped like a mango, pauses on the step box before alighting into the car. Mango hooks his index finger in the air, parts his dry lips, but no sound, no question mark comes out. You're in compartment C, sir, says Baxter, even though the conductor just told that to the passenger. Baxter's not sure what more the passenger might want to know right now, or what the silent hooked finger might mean. Welcome aboard, says Baxter. Midnight, Mango says. Then he slips the finger into a breast pocket and slides out a business card. He flips the card to Baxter. The profession says optician. On the back, the passenger has printed in tiny letters, midnight, not a minute later. The card's sharp corners jab Baxter's fingertips. He will still be coaxing passengers to settle into their berths at midnight. He'll be tripping over pillows and pajamas at midnight. He has a shadowy idea about what the man's tiny and precise lettering means, but passengers can be shifty creatures, affably baring their teeth one moment, but in the next doing so wickedly. Baxter has no time to play a personal Dorothy Dix and listen to Mango's nighttime confessions about a moldering love affair or a profligate brother during the time he needs to black boots and fill out reports. Passengers will still be toppling around drunk or ringing at him for the ladder or meandering back and forth to the toilet, back and forth, pestering him to ask, when will the train pass through Octopus? Or why has the train slowed down? As if he rides on top of the train when he's out of their sight. Maybe Mango the optician can scoop out Baxter's human eyes and pop owl telescope eyes into Baxter's eye sockets instead. Feathers drift before Baxter's eyes. He blinks them away, rubs his glasses with a handkerchief. Not feathers. Hardly any sleep last night. No sleep for 2 nights on the run before this, and now his eyeballs are fogging up. He slides the optician's card into his breast pocket. And I'll just stop there.
Lisa, you want to start the ask?
I just take Carrie, the way this novel made me feel. I mean, it's so claustrophobic. You feel the tiredness, you feel the rhythm of the whole train of moving. You want to talk a little bit about that? Did you travel a lot on the train? How did you keep it all so packed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because train travel, at least on my side of the country, there's not a ton of it because it's really, really expensive. Whereas in kind of Eastern Central Canada, there's a bit more kind of commuter train culture. But when I was a kid and when train travel was a lot cheaper, my parents for every March break would take me and my brothers on a train trip from Calgary to Vancouver, which was like, I think it was a 2-night trip, maybe 2 nights, maybe 1 night, I can't remember. Anyway, and so I just loved that trip because Calgary is in the prairies. It's pretty brown. At that time of year, there was maybe snow and crusty old snow. And then as it traveled, it would go through these glorious mountains and through these, past, these gorges, and the land would become greener and greener and more lush. And so it was always a trip that I really, really loved. And the part that was especially attractive to me even as a kid and now I did some train travel as research for this book, was the constant rocking and lying in bed if we were lucky enough to get berths, lying in bed or even lying on the economy seat, sitting in the economy seats and just being rocked to sleep. Like I just love that so much. And also the sensation of moving while standing still was just awesome to me. So it's, I had it as a kid. I had that feeling as a kid and I just adored it. And then as an adult, as I was doing research for this, we did a trip that was, I think, 3 nights. And it was also very interesting as an adult to see how those trips worked in terms of, we had a beautiful time, but what was the labor involved in giving us a beautiful time? And so, observing the workers, talking to the porters, those kinds of people, although they were kind of like, why are you talking to me so much? So whatever. so part of the reason, but what became very clear as we were traveling was, it was beautiful. The landscape was gorgeous, but as the day went on, it became more and more claustrophobic in that we could not get off the train. You can travel back and forth like this, and that's it. You can go to the dining car, you can go to the observation car, but you couldn't actually run anywhere. You couldn't, the more and more as the day went on, I could feel the walls closing in on me. So it was this kind of very luxurious, strange confinement. And part of the other reason why the book takes place on the train is just my own anxiety as a first-time writer of historical fiction, because I'd never written historical fiction before. I was terrified of not getting the details correct. And what happened, like a glorious accident, was that, I was traveling across the country and into Chicago and New York, going into different archives and reading about trains. But just coincidentally, 8 hours away by car is a railway museum, and they have a perfectly restored 1929 passenger car and dining car. And so I was able to go in there, and they had really done their work. They were very careful. So I could go in there, and even though it was, one of those, we couldn't linger. It was one of those tours where they would kind of race you through, but I just raced through over and over again. And at one point asked the interpreter, please, can I just hang out for a little bit and take some photos? And that was hugely important for me as a writer, because I thought, you know what, if I keep the action on the train, I'm not going to make there won't be any historical inaccuracies, because here I am, I've time, it was sort of like a little time travel pod. And so, there's very little that happens in this book that happens off the train, partly because I'm just terrified. I was just terrified of getting the details wrong, but also it ended up working fine, just structurally. It made a lot of sense in the end. So
it ties the whole book together, because I guess you're officially 2 trips, but really, or there's the empty one that we don't.
Yeah, that's right. There's the prologue, with the deadheading, and that's right. Yeah.
I would like to say that you discovered the lives of the porters, which are so important to the book, at the train museum. But actually, I read that your mentor actually talked to you about that.
Yeah. So, my mentor. So it was an old creative writing professor of mine, Fred Waugh, who, long after I'd taken his course, I took poetry from him. I didn't take fiction from him, but I learned a lot about language from him. So I have great respect for him. I always have. And he just said in passing, he said, Suzette, you have to write about the sleeping car porters. This was like 20 plus years ago. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I'd never heard of the sleeping car porters. I didn't know what he was saying. And so, because I was interviewing for a job at a university and they wanted me to talk about a current project or future projects that I could work on and apply for grants to fund, I said, yeah, I'm working on this train book. It's about sleeping car porters. Whatever. I don't know what that means. So as I, was working on this fake book, because it was my fake book, because it's so not my process when I'm writing a book to talk about what I'm working on, because I don't need people saying that's a terrible idea or that's been done before. I would always throw this train book at people and say, yeah, I'm working on this book about sleeping car porters. And I think it's good that it took me so long to write the book, because I don't think I really had the writing chops back then that I do now. That's like however many 5 books ago, or no, I guess it would have been like 3 books ago. And as I started poking around doing the research for this book, I realized just how important the sleeping car porters were in terms of, the history of Black people in North America. I mean, they were certainly in the United States and somewhat in Canada, they were fundamental to the creation of the Black middle class. In Canada, we have, Oscar Peterson, who's one of our most treasured jazz pianists. His father was a sleeping car porter who just had ambition for his kid. And his sister, Daisy Peterson, I'm not sure what her married name is, but she was also a very talented musician. And then there's also like senators who were former sleeping car porters. There was a nightclub in Montreal in the 30s and 40s called Rockhead's Paradise, which was actually it was a former sleeping car porter who owned and ran that bar, because he'd been smuggling liquor when he was a sleeping car porter. So neighborhoods sprang up around sleeping car porters in the communities in which they lived. They were very, very ambitious men. They were very educated men, either through formal education or just being on the road and seeing how other people live. They were, and rubbing shoulders with all kinds of people. So, this is taking me a very long time to get to my point, but for a long time I thought, well, this is really interesting, that's great, but it has nothing to do with me, because I thought, okay, that's either sleeping car porters either were Americans who had migrated up to Canada, Like, so, people from Oklahoma who immigrated up to Canada in order to become farmers. So maybe it was that Black population, or it was the Nova Scotia Loyalists, in way Eastern Maritime Canada, so it was those Black populations. And my mother, which is the Black side of my family, she's from the Caribbean. She's a first generation Canadian. And so, I thought, what can I, as a person of Caribbean heritage, how can I possibly be related to the sleeping car porters? But what I found out while I was doing my research was that the Canadian Pacific Railway, and there were some other railway companies who were actively recruiting sleeping car porters from the Caribbean. And so suddenly the story was maybe not so far away from me as I thought. And in like very early drafts, I had actually written this as a prohibition story, where it was about a guy who was who lived in Montreal, and was, smuggling alcohol just smuggling liquor. And so it was going to be that kind of Al Capone story. And I was talking to a historian, and she said, that's been done. Like, it's not an interesting story. And she said, what about a guy, a Black man who's from Alabama, who sees the Rocky Mountains for the first time? And suddenly that was amazing to me, because I live only an hour and a half from the Rocky Mountains. Like, if I go, I live in a city where if I climb a high enough hill, I can see the Rocky Mountains from that hill. So even though this project began as a topic that had nothing to do with me, suddenly it was getting closer and closer and closer to me. And then this is just a very long story, but at a certain point we found out that the man who my mother thought was her father wasn't actually her father. And so we have family in Georgia. So it was just it's been a wild, long, weird ride trying to locate this character and finding a character who it turns out I could easily be related to. I certainly feel related to in terms of chosen family, So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well,
I try to sum up like decades of work and your research.
First, I want to say I'm sort of shocked that you were worried about historical accuracy, because based on your body, I wanted to read every book that you written after this, but I did actually wind up reading your previous book, Dr. Edith Main and the Heirs of Crawley Hall, and I can sort of see the through line for the two books, and they're very much, you really took the genre and made it your own. But I feel like, and even historical fiction writers are willing to bend the story if it's a very important to the book. So was there something that now you're like, confess, well, I knew this wasn't true, but I had to put it in anyway?
Yeah, that was part of the journey, right? Was figuring out, okay, what are the accurate, what's accurate, and what can I play with? And I needed to, for years, I had to make sure I knew what those limits were, that I didn't want to have like zippers appearing when zippers weren't invented yet or whatever. So one thing that I did mess around with was that, so he's an extra on a line that goes across the country, and that was a highly, highly coveted line, and no extra probably would have ever done that line. The other thing too is that often what would happen is that sleeping car porters would travel from, Ontario. So let's say, in United States term, like say just above Detroit, all the way to Winnipeg, which I don't know where that is above.
It's Minneapolis.
Sort of Minneapolis. Yeah. So they would travel there, and then they trade out, and new sleeping car porters would get on board, and then a new set would go. So, I deliberately didn't name the company he worked for, because I thought, no, I'll just create my own company and play with the labor laws and that kind of thing. But, coincidentally, because, I was speaking to this historian, and she said, there's no way there would be a trip across the country. But in my research, a trip where, a sleeping car porter would be on a train for that long. But I ended up finding, in the Winnipeg archives, a very strange random article that said, sleeping car porters make good tips and they are well paid for their jobs. And it talked specifically about porters who had a line from Winnipeg or from Eastern Canada to Western Canada. So I think it was very rare. The other thing too is that this line that I'm writing about, the Trans-Canada, it died in like 1930 because of the onset of the Depression. So it wasn't around for very long. So that might be why there's not so much information on it. So I did play around with, would basically a substitute teacher, a substitute porter, would he get this amazing a trip? Oh, probably not, but nobody.
You don't make it sound that amazing.
I was gonna say, not without sleep, man.
No, horrible. But I guess you'd get a lot of tips. So I think it would be great that way.
35 cents, 50
No
cents.
sleep. Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm gonna pass to Lisa, but I feel like one of the things that's so distinctive about at least these two books is that the sleep deficit really leads to some unusual visions, as we say. As we did say, and I hope the folks here, we're expecting most people have read the book because the book's been out for a while and we did some book clubs with it, and there was a lot of discussion over whether those experiences, those visions were real or just caused by fatigue. And I like the fact that I'm sure you have an idea, but I like the fact that people weren't on the same page about it.
Yeah. I kind of leave that up to the reader to decide whether they're real or not. Yeah.
There was a point where I thought, okay, are we going to have it end up where he's not really on the train anymore and he's actually in a mental institute, and that all these things that he's envisioning are
was all a dream.
And I probably just fell asleep too. So I was probably really tired. But I think the way you brought the spiritualists into it helped, sort of solidify the possibility, but also open up that there wasn't necessarily that possibility. And then bringing his aunt and the island lore and beliefs into it. You did it so beautifully and so subtly that it felt, I don't know, you just felt it so strongly. Yeah.
So, part of my background, certainly with my mother's culture, and I hesitate, so I'm not going to say that definitively this is how it is, because we haven't been back home for a very, very long time. And I think things are different now. However, I talked to another writer from Trinidad, and I think he agreed with me. It was pretty common when I was a kid for my mother to say strange things, to talk about the supernatural as if it was absolutely normal. And of course, so she would occasionally have dreams that were, that told her things that nobody had told her before. So for example, she dreamed, I hadn't come out to her, but she dreamed that I was queer and said to me, so are you sleeping with women? And I was like, how could you possibly know that? I mean, I'm sure I was throwing all kinds of cues out, right? but it was like, you're psychic. But she would also say things. She would also say, yeah, she found my magazine or whatever. Anyway, yeah. but she would also say things, we moved into this house. We moved into a house when I was 18, and she said, yeah, there's a ghost on the second floor, but it's okay. The ghost is benevolent. It's all right. So it was just statements like that just were very random. And, there was nothing weird about it. And I think it had to do a little bit with Obeah culture from where she came from in the Caribbean, which is the supernatural is part of the everyday, and right. It's not like, it's not like people are wandering around with wands and, doing telekinesis, but there's sort of there's another understanding of reality, which is that dreams are sometimes real. Of course, ghosts exist, that kind of thing. So
yeah,
I wanted to have a little bit of that element in the book.
If you do have questions, by the way, you can ask them in chat. We already have one question, one comment. And also you can do Q&A as well. The difference being in Q&A, only we see the question, and chat, everybody sees it. So they can answer for you, I guess. But my question is, and this is such an important part of the book for me, why a dentist?
Why a dentist? So it became really important to me as I was writing the book that he have some kind of passion that would help him escape the everyday, and that he have some sort of goal, and that he think about, you know, there's more to life than this, because the job is just such drudgery, and dealing with the passengers is just, it's not fun. So he needed to have some sort of goal. But what I really liked about dentistry, well, actually how it first started was that he, you know, he has that book, The Scarab from Jupiter. Originally that book was actually Dracula, and he when he was contemplating that book, he was thinking about the fangs and how the fangs in Dracula work, because, you know, in order to actually extract blood from someone, you would probably need to rip a hole in their throat in order to get at it. But with Dracula, no, it's just two little white, you know, depressions or whatever, two little holes, and somehow, you know, and so I had a whole scene that just went on for way too long, where Baxter's thinking about, well, do the fangs actually have suction capabilities? And that's how he's able to suck the blood out. And, you know, and so he became obsessed with teeth in that scene. And then I thought, you know, that's actually kind of interesting, this obsession with teeth. And so I started looking at different historical textbooks, you know, a textbook from 1917 about dentistry and dental care that was pretty wild, because on one hand, so many things haven't changed. So the, you know, teeth all have the same name, and we talk about the max. I don't even know how to say them. I've only ever read them. So, you know, the upper and lower jaws. But there were also parts of the book where, you know, when dealing with children and doing dental work on children, make sure there's another adult who can hold the child between their knees, as you come at it, you know, and basically the default was like, get the pliers, and, you know, so it was fascinating. It was actually fascinating. So, and then I realized that it worked great as a metaphor, because Baxter, he has to know his passengers really well. He has to actually know them better than they know themselves. He has to read them in order to anticipate their needs, so that he won't, you know, screw up and lose his job potentially. And so, you know, being able to look inside someone's mouth, you're looking into them, and you can also read so much in teeth. You can read, you know, you can read how stressed out the person is, because if they've got, you know, a particular kind of, you know, so people who grind their teeth are kind of flat. You can read their, you know, what people's hobbies are. You know, you can read if they, you know, smoke or drink too much. You can read class into their teeth, you know, so all kinds of things. So he can know his passengers even better by looking inside them. And what better way to do that than to look literally into someone's mouth and, you know, maybe see even further down their throat.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And I mean, it also is a source of much humor in the book. And I also think narrative tension. I mean, I could almost see like two clickers. One is like, how much money for dental school? The other one is how many demerits. Yeah. And, you know, it really drives the tension and narrative along. I love the fact that I wanted to read, I mean, I didn't really want to read a whole lot, but, you know, I was just underlining all my teeth things, and then gave that book away. And then I have a new book that I bought. But I believe I believe he counts teeth when he goes to sleep.
Yes.
At one point,
instead of counting sheep, he counts teeth. Yeah. Yeah.
Yay. That's all I have to say. Dental heroes, few and far between.
That was also another area of anxiety for me, which was, will I get the teeth right? But then I thought, he's an amateur. He's learning it from a book he found, you know, so if I make mistakes, it's okay.
Doesn't matter. You need dental sensitivity reading.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, so Dracula was something that you wrote in, but then wrote out. Was there anything in your research that sort of was that tipping point? Like you talked about the train, that tipping point where you're like, oh, this is perfect. This is bringing it all together.
When I found out about the spiritualist whom I modeled the spider on, and I can't remember her name. I was going to look that up before I came here today. I think her name was Mina Crandon, maybe, but she was a famous spiritualist who, you know, she was really interesting because she, as her spirit control, she would channel her dead brother Walter, and so speak with a deep voice and whistle at the girls and whatever with this, you know, while being possessed by her brother Walter. And she ended up being a huge phony. Houdini even came and, you know, tested her out, and she just was a complete fake. But once I was able to have that character as a kind of, I don't know, I guess I'd call her a plot device, right? Because what she does is she brings a lot of characters together, and she also taps into Baxter and Baxter's kind of connection with the supernatural and or hallucinations. Then the book came together. That said, actually, the most important moment for me was when so in an early draft, kind of nothing happened. It was just him traveling across the country and, you know, the various interactions with the different passengers. And I realized I have no story, I have no tension, there's no momentum here. And it wasn't until I read in passing about a via rail train, passenger train, that was caught in the mountains like recently, you know, for 45 hours, that I thought, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. There's a mudslide and he's stuck in the mountains. And that's when everything's going to come to a head. So what freaks me out, I love writing. I love being involved in a novel, you know, and trying to figure out what it's about. But I always have these moments of panic where, you know, it makes me so mad that sometimes key parts of a novel, I only figure them out by accident. So I just happen to read, you know, that news about the via rail train. I just happened to read about Mina Crandon, you know, when I was reading something else, when I should have been doing work, and instead I was fooling around on my phone and fell down one of those, you know, research holes. So that's the scary part for me. It's also it's exciting, but it's kind of awful, you know. So Mina Crandon, or the spider rather, she was really important in terms of bringing the book together, and also coming across that train stuck in the mountains. Yeah.
You're muted. Oh,
I know I'm muted,
like,
but I kept clicking on it.
Oh.
We're still in COVID, I guess, because our laundry bell went off. So I was like, does everyone need to hear that that's done? But then, and as I knew, and whenever I mute, I'm like, I can't get it. I love. Let's go back now. Serious pose. I loved that you have really did a great job, I think, with all the passengers and the porters. Like, there's so many distinctive personalities. Like, you know, I feel like you almost, I guess that you wrote, I don't know if you're that kind of writer, but I guess that you had written more backstory than is in the book, because they felt so rich. I'd love for you to talk about that and some of your favorite characters, side characters. And stuff.
Yes, I had written a lot more about them, and I also had way more passengers. And the book, like this book, the penultimate draft was about 40 pages longer because there were more passengers and but it was just kind of the same thing over and over and over again. And my editor was, you know, I said, okay, just tell me what isn't working then. And so she just kind of crossed out big chunks. And I said, this book is going to be really short. She said, don't worry about it. It's okay. It's okay. Anyway, so let me think about it. I believe trying to remember. So what actually happened was I merged a few characters. So Punch and Judy was originally two sets of couples. And one of the couples, and this doesn't appear in the book, was I was really fascinated. I've always been fascinated by that historical moment where, you know, it's early 1929 and the economy is like this, and then suddenly we hit, I think it's October, and then the economy is like that. and then we end up in the Depression. And
So this is
kind of
right.
cusp.
And it's right
Sorry?
before that, right?
It's right before that. It's right before that. So, you know, what I'm hoping people might guess at is that, you know, this train is stuffed full of rich people, but they're not going to be rich a few months from now, or they're not going to be rich this time next year. There's catastrophe happening, and Punch and Judy, the catastrophe is already happening with them. And so I did have, you know, more of a story about, you know, what was their business and why was their business falling apart. And then I realized that kind of has nothing to do with anything. It doesn't matter. The other character who had much more backstory was Andrew Swain, the entertainer, the vaudeville entertainer, because in early drafts, actually, so this book was far more supernatural in early drafts. There was a whole compartment that was haunted, like seriously haunted, and Andrew Swain was actually a ghost, and you know, he was haunting, and it was getting just weirder and weirder and didn't make much sense. And I thought, ugh, it's so boring. Anyway, so Andrew Swain, you know, his backstory was that he was a ghost, and then it just didn't make any sense. And it was far more interesting to have him as a real person. And then I came across, you know, once again by accident, which is so frustrating, this historical figure named, I think his name was Jean Malin, or Malin, Malin, who was a female impersonator in quotation marks, who, you know, was extremely successful. And I thought it's just so intriguing to me how, you know, kind of what we would call, you know, queer performance and representation or presentation was accepted in such a wide way back then, even though, you know, you would think it's a long time ago, so therefore people would be a bit more, I don't know, they wouldn't be as accepting. He was hugely famous. He was hugely famous, although he was not, I think he had a wife, but just as a beard, right? I think he was actually a gay man, or I think he had a girlfriend, something like that. Anyway, so there was this man, Jean Malin, who part of his shtick was that he would put on his beautiful clothes and the makeup and the wig and everything. And so he was this beautiful blonde woman, and then he would regularly like punch people out. So, you know, Andrew Swain was a lot bigger and messier, and at one point was one of the undead in an early draft. And it just, you know, I'm definitely one of those writers who early manuscripts are way long, and then they just get shaved down and cut and polished and characters merged and massaged, and yeah. So
Once again, not surprised, having read Dr. Edith Vane, but, but also one of the weird things is that we hosted not that long ago a book called The History of Drag in Milwaukee, and one of their points was that this is, you know, acceptance of gender identity morphing and things has been more of a cycle than one continuous, you know, acceptance and then repression, and I think the 20s was, as you said, I think one of those times of acceptance.
Yeah, I think it was pre-Hays Code, so there was a lot more. You could get away with a lot more than you could, say, heading into the 30s and later. I forget when the Hays Code was, but yeah.
What about the Porters? And then I promise I won't say anything, at least.
The Porters. So Eugene, the character Eugene, had way more attached to him. So there was, you know, when I was writing this book, or not when I was writing it, when I was proposing it, you know, in order to get grants or whatever for work, I repeatedly had people telling me, well, you should write about the formation of the Brotherhood. You should write about the labor relations. You should write about the Union and those kinds of, you know, that kind of history. But it seemed to me that that was everywhere. And that's the story that everybody wanted to tell. And at one point in this book, Eugene had way more profile in terms of the work he did for, you know, labor rights, and it was great, but it kind of had nothing to do with my character, because Baxter, the thing about Baxter is that, you know, on one hand, he is a porter and he would like the conditions to be better, but he's also a gay man. He's a queer man who needs to watch out and has to be really careful. So I think, you know, this also being a story about the whole labor battle, and unions, et cetera, it was just becoming more of a distraction than it was hampering the novel as opposed to helping it. And so Eugene had way more, he was way more, he had his magazines and he had his post, he was doing all kinds of things in earlier drafts, and it was just not working. It's beside the point. It's not what Baxter is about, really.
I'm not giving away anything, but I love how when you said what at one point the book was about, smuggling alcohol, that you have a little shout out to that at one point in the book.
Yeah.
Here's the book that wasn't.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's too much of a spoiler, but yes, that's exactly true.
We're spoiler friendly. Like I said, I don't think it affects things, but it doesn't. But on the other hand, I won't say.
Okay.
Apparently, I'm spoiler friendly, but I'm not saying this point.
But you really get a sense of all of the shaved down parts of it, because you can make reference, and we're just going along because it's important, but it's just the background news of what we all deal with every day. So it's not the main story, but you didn't make any of it go away. You bring all of those things in, and it just keeps us, it keeps it historical.
Yeah, I not, hopefully I'm hearing your question correctly, but I was thinking a lot about, Hemingway's theory of iceberg theory and the theory of omission, which is, as a writer, you do all of this background work and you have all that information and you know everything, but then what you give the reader is just like, a teeny bit of what the actual iceberg. So
you can see it in the book. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like when they try to narrow down, a writer will try to narrow down, it's a checklist of what they have to cover. And you can feel the checklist just being tacked onto the center story. And yours doesn't feel tacked on. It feels very organic in what is just what's going around him all the time. And it's all that good hard work. So thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Bins and bins of notes. Esme, yeah.
Esme, let's talk about Esme.
What do you want to talk about with Esme?
Well, just Esme, just the character and how she's just as that whole thing of constantly on him. And nowadays, I think, if there was a child, the child would just be put in a chair, and that whole change, it's so different in how we allow kids, she was allowed to move around with him. She was allowed to help.
Yeah, so Esme was drawn from, I think I'd been reading, it was either a book about porters or it was an interview with a porter where that particular porter talked about suddenly being put in charge of a little girl, I think it was a little girl whose parents had died, and the kid was being shipped across the country, and he was in charge of making sure that the kid got from point A to point B, which is so different from child rearing practices now, right? That trust of the porters. And it's, I had someone say to me, well, isn't it, there is no way, isn't it anachronistic to have a Black man taking care of a child? Like, wouldn't, white people wouldn't let Black people take care of their kids. And I'm like, well, what about the whole mammy tradition, right? That's all about Black people taking care of white children and putting white children ahead of their own kids. So Esme, I wanted her, and I wanted their relationship. She's work for him, she's work, but she's also not work. I mean, she's also a person who is in deep, deep grief and who hasn't yet, I would think, been tainted by racism. She hasn't learned racism yet. And so she meets Baxter, and they're kindred spirits. They are both interested in beetles that eat humans. They're both interested in, science fiction and in the planets. And so they connect on that level. And so, and I wanted her to be a little bit weird so that she would be attractive for him, so that she would be more than work for him. And so that's part of the reason why, she, for example, has that little porcelain horse toy that she carries with her, which I deliberately stole from my friend Jim. So I have this friend Jim who, told me about when he was a child, he had a porcelain horse that he always slept with. And I'm like, how do you hug a porcelain horse? Like, teddy bears are comfy, but he has this kind of pointy, sharp thing that he sleeps with, but it completely suit his personality. And so, I wanted to bring that in to show that she's not necessarily, what you see is not necessarily what you get just because she's a little girl. I wanted her to be a little bit odd. And so I don't know if it's maybe a little bit too on the nose, but just the fact that she clings to Baxter and won't let him go. Like she's very much, it seems to me, she metaphorically represents the burden he has of having to please these white people and always having to serve them, and he can't ever escape from them. But at the same time, it's also her just loving him so incredibly fiercely, or it's that he's one adult who will actually give her the attention that she needs. So I wanted her to be an old person in a very young person's body, and also be a kindred spirit in that she also is a great appreciator of the weird. Yeah.
Cool. I just wanted to say it was like you were at our book club, because we had that exact discussion about a Black caretaker for a young child. And I said, in the culture of service at the time, like you're reading the present into the past, that this would have just been assumed that this kid would be perfectly fine in the presence of a Black service person. And I thought, so it was weird to be reading and rereading the book. Particularly, I've been watching White Lotus, which is, of course, also about the service people in not a train, but a hotel, and often people of color or queer, and what the burden that they have to go through. So I don't know what to say about that. I just thought it was interesting, like that the show and your book, which your book was written well before, unless you're buddies with Mike White. Really,
I loved White Lotus. I'm going to put that out there.
Really talk to each other,
Yeah, well, I think what was really well done in White Lotus is how, as much as the people who were doing the service work, they got to know the customers or the clients, they could never trust those clients. Like even, what looked like, sincere expressions of friendship just aren't, or everybody misinterprets everybody. And there's always that power differential. And with Baxter, even though she's this tiny little girl, there is a power differential. And, for that reason, and I don't think this is okay, I won't go into detail, but she's the person who betrays him, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that was a whole, their relationship was difficult to write, because I didn't want to romanticize. I didn't want it to look like, Baxter is just fine with her and it's all good and he loves her, when really, she makes his job harder. She makes it harder.
Yeah.
He's got to carry her around and deal with her when he's just trying to get some sleep, or when he's, trying to, put clean sheets in a berth and that kind of thing. So I wanted it deliberately ambiguous.
We have one really intense question in chat, which I want to make sure I get to. And it's about being a porter, being a closeted gay man, how Baxter code switches, and wanted a writer, Pat, wanted you to talk a little about what went into your thinking on that, and how you wrote that, how you were thinking about writing that predicament that he was in.
Okay, so Baxter as a porter and Baxter as a gay man.
Yeah.
I think I don't quite understand what code switching is within this context.
I guess I think she means not being, I don't think she doesn't talk about going from Black to white, but more from gay man to closeted, to straight man, I guess. It's a long. Let's see. Can you see the chat?
Oh.
If you look at the chat, and it's above my pay grade. So
Oh, I see. Okay, how Baxter code switches constantly in both identities as a gay man for safety and as a conductor for relating to people, but also having to maintain his professional job slash status or status slash job. And yet he is confined within the boundaries of the train cars, yet on a train that's moving. Were you thinking of those tensions when you wrote? I would say, and I hope I understand the question correctly.
It's interesting to me just because I felt like Baxter didn't really like he was sometimes not giving of information, but he never really seemed to pretend to be
Right.
a Casanova or something like that. You know, he kept himself sort of the Martian, you know.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Yeah. So what this makes me think about in particular is, so this is much later in the book when Edwin drew his, so this is spoiler friendly, right?
That's right. You can say.
So, yeah.
Say
Okay. So Edwin Drew, his lover, is training him. So Edwin Drew is his porter instructor. And he not only teaches him, this is how you make a bed, but he also teaches him how to be. And part of that is, you know, if you want to make tips, you got to do what you got to do, which is if somebody wants you to dance, then dance. If they want to ride you like a horse, then let them ride you like a horse, but don't Uncle Tom it. Don't grin. So, and it's a really messy kind of gross lesson that Edwin is, you know, trying to pass on to Baxter, which is that, you know, if you have to do, you know, act out those stereotypes that white people have of you, do the minstrel show, because if you do the minstrel show, you'll get the money. And as much as Baxter loves Edwin Drew and worships him, he doesn't do that. He does not, he won't do it. You know, so when passengers say, you know, dance for us, he lies and says, I don't know how to dance, you know. And so that was really tricky for me a little bit when I was writing about, spoiler, when I was writing about Baxter's sexual interactions with a white passenger, because it was kind of, you know, is this prostitution or is it his own desire, you know, and how does that, so when that passenger gives him a tip at the end of the book, you know, is that payment for sex, or is that I'm a passenger and this is the tip I would normally give you? I don't think this is necessarily addressing what this question is about.
No, but it's very interesting. So I'm glad you're saying it.
Yeah. I thought about that too, that
Me
difference. And it is maybe a lot of what she's talking about in the question, because he does kind of work in those spaces. You know, he kind of does switch back and forth.
Yeah.
Because he can see the difference. He's not, you know, he doesn't see it in the end as he sees it, I think, as a tip.
And do I have to say this right? At one point, he does he's like says to himself, "Don't give me a tip. Don't give me a tip."
Yeah.
And not to bring in weird cultural references, but there's an episode of Seinfeld where he starts sleeping with the woman cleaning his house.
Yeah.
Which leads to the same sort of weird, like, huh? You know, it's very complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Yeah. So, you know, Baxter, I think Baxter, he resists going all the way. He will be the automaton. He will act as a robot in order to do his job, but he won't go that extra bit that Edwin Drew kind of encourages him to do, which is to just sell himself out completely. And I know that I was probably playing fast and loose with history, you know, and historical accuracy and how that might actually go. Maybe I don't really know. It was so hard. It was so hard figuring out the psychology of sleeping car porters at that time, and because sleeping car porters in general, it just struck me, were very, they didn't talk about their jobs a lot with civilians. They were very protective of their reputations. And so it wasn't until I found, a memoir or two by sleeping car porters. There was one by this guy, Johnny Curvin, where he just let it all hang out. But I think he was also maybe lying a little bit. Some of it seemed pretty crazily embellished, because he was talking about how a female passenger said, she thought he was really attractive. And she said, if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to accuse you of rape, and then you're going to lose your job. And so that was a whole segment of that book, and him saying, well, she was extremely good looking, and boy, it was difficult, but not, it was just a very weird moment in that book. Anyway, I'm sort of getting way off topic.
I can see that actually though happening.
I can totally see it happening. The way Curvin writes about it in the book is that she was a very sexy redhead, so it wasn't too difficult to do. And
so we think he was lying because she was actually
maybe
perhaps not as attractive as he made her out to be.
Yeah, and
okay, very good.
Non-consensual sex is non-consensual. I would think, that I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't make it better when they're hot.
No.
On another note,
it's just me. Yeah,
I think it's all of us. Anyway, we did want to make sure we didn't close before you recommended a couple of books too.
Sure. Okay, so I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me. So one book that I have just loved recently is The Red Chesterfield by Wayne Arthurson. I can put it in the chat if that helps, or I'm not sure.
I can
okay, yeah. So The Red Chesterfield by Wayne Arthurson, and it's this adorable little how would I call it, deconstructed detective fiction. So the chapters are all 1 page long, and it's actually a bylaw officer who is doing his bylaw officer thing, and he comes across a red Chesterfield in a ditch, and he's like, this is not good, and I'm gonna have to write up a ticket. Who did this? And then he finds a severed foot beside the red Chesterfield, and so so it goes from being a mystery about who put the red Chesterfield in the ditch to who does this foot belong to, and who did the murdering, et cetera, et cetera. But it goes way off track, and it's actually really sweet and very funny and really great. And then there's a book of essays about love, sort of like an anti-love book of essays by a woman named Micah Jacobson. I'll put her name in the chat just because her spelling is a bit unusual. And the book is called Modern Fables. And it's a book of essays. It's very funny and scathing and just beautifully written. And then the last book I'll recommend is one of the other Giller Prize shortlisted books. I mean, they're all good, but one book that I quite enjoyed was Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century by Kim Fu. It's a fabulous book, really interesting short stories. So I've given you a novel, essays, and some short stories.
You've given us everything. And I will say that Lesser Known Monsters does have a staff rec card in our store. So
okay, yeah.
One enthusiastic reader.
So good.
Lisa, would you like to say some closing words? And if you missed a question, you should also ask your last question.
I did not miss a question. I just think it was really such a great read. I find myself thinking so much about being in that space, and I just appreciated it. And I learned a lot too.
Thank you. I'm so happy. That's great. It's been so gratifying, I think, because I was so stressed out about this book. I was so stressed out about the whole historical part. So it's great that it's resonating. And I also thought, how niche can you get as far as topics go? But it's really surprising to me.
Niche is power.
Yeah.
Niche is power.
Oh, it pulls it in. It does. I've traveled on the train a lot, and you do get that closed up feeling.
Yeah, we have an annual train book discussion. So last year we did Small World by Jonathan Evison.
Oh,
Maybe it'll be annual now. One book must be set on train.
We'll do that. All will do
Well, thank you
Ah,
so much.
thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. It's just, it's actually an amazing question, challenging question.
It was a fun discussion. Yeah,
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Totally fun. I enjoyed
you
it
so
too.
much.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have been invited.
It's an honor to
much.
have you.
Yes, so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.